Okay, why don't we get started? Welcome to the session we call Budget Cuts, Reading the Tea Leaves. I think all it takes is reading the morning papers to read the tea leaves these days. This is front and center this week and next week. It's a very timely session. Of course, people on this panel think budgeting is always front and center, but sometimes it actually breaks the water and everybody pays attention to it. We have assembled a wonderful panel, I think, of people who are insiders, observers, of this process, both within the agencies and from even other places. So we're going to have a very lively discussion. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to moderate it. My name is Paul Posner. I'm the director of the Public Administration Program at George Mason University, formerly led GO's work on the federal budget, among other things. And so I'm going to kind of pose questions to our wonderful panelists here. We're going to kind of have a conversation. This is set up like a living room. And so we're going to have some dialogue amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for questions and try to kind of get out of here by 10:45. As I said, we have assembled a wonderful panel, a kind of cross-section of budgeting, if you will, with people from the largest agency in government to a small congressional agency to a major domestic agency to someone who has experience in national economic policy making from the White House. So I think you'll find that we're really going to have some wonderful dialogue. On the far left is Jeff Page. Jeff is the CFO at the Library of Congress since 2005. He's responsible for budgeting, finance, accounting, and chairs a board of comparable CFOs across the entire Ledge branch. Before that, he was in the budgeting area in the Corporation for National Service, and we're glad to have Jeff join us here. On my immediate left is Deanna Farrell, who has got a lot to do with this conference, and she's a principal at McKinsey. Notably, for several years, she was the deputy director of the National Economic Council under President Obama, working for Larry Summers, and covered a lot of interesting issues, including financial regulatory reform and the Automobile Task Force, among others. Interesting times that you were condemned to live with in those times, and I'm sure fascinating observations that you have about that. On my immediate right is Mike McCord. Mike is the Deputy Comptroller of the Department of Defense and has quite a portfolio himself, and interesting times as well, I'm sure. Mike has lived these issues on the Hill for about 24 years, mostly the Senate Armed Services Committee, and for a bit with the House Budget Committee. So Mike will have a lot to say here, and Karin, Karin O'Leary is with us. She's the budget director of the Department of Justice, and she's been with DOJ for several years in that capacity, and before that was with the Drug Enforcement Administration, and she has maybe one of the unique advantages of anybody in town recently, that she actually has an appropriation that seems to have been agreed to for the next 10 months, which is kind of a luxury at this point. So that's kind of the panel we have. I just want to give a few figures to kind of, not to scare you, but yes, to scare you. These are scary times in some ways, but as budgeteers would say, now we have them where we want them. Budgeting is not linear. There's a time for joy and a time for sadness, a time for giving and a time for taking away. I think we're in one of those latter periods. We went through periods where we spent a lot of money on the wars and a lot of money on economic recovery, and now we have a deficit where we kind of have a perfect storm of coming together of short-term economics with long-term demographics and healthcare, large deficits but difficult economic times, very ambiguous signals about what we do. We, of course, know what happened in the summer. Congress and the President pulled back from the brink of default by passing a Budget Control Act, of course, which implements a whole new regime of budget controls. Even before that, we know that there were tremendous polarization and conflict. Most of the government lived on a CR for fiscal 11 that was $3 billion lower for defense and $39 billion lower for non-defense and budget authority than the previous levels. The Budget Control Act has enacted a new set of constraints, two important constraints. One is new caps on discretionary spending, which will promise to lower discretionary spending by $418 billion for non-defense and $445 for defense. excluding the wars, by 2021 in budget authority, compared to CBO's baseline. And then we have this other thing that's kind of the wild card, the super committee, which is mandated to come up with $1.2 trillion of cuts. And if not, we also know that there's a sword of Damocles hanging over them, which says that there will be pain meted out in additional cuts on both defense and non-defense of considerable magnitude by 2021. Now, whether that actually happens, there's a lot of imponderables here. Will the super committee come up with something that actually discharges their responsibility by legislating policy changes? If not, will Congress and the President spend the next year with all the changes that are going to happen and let the sequesters actually go into effect, which are not scheduled to go into effect for 13 months? Big question marks on both scores, I think we see. So that's the environment that we face in budgeting. In some ways, it's not new. Budgeting is always about conflict. It's always about uncertainty. It's always about putting trillions of dollars of need into a much smaller set of constraints and making tough choices. But I think we would all say these are particularly difficult times. And so I think I'd maybe start with ask this panel of seasoned people who've been around for a while. You know, in the current environment, would you say that this year, maybe this past several years, constitute possibly the most difficult year for federal agencies in developing and managing budgets? Are these the worst of times, essentially? How would you all respond to that? Want to start, Deanna?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it, and I would say that at some level there's sort of a political context and a rhetorical context that is probably as heated as we've seen on this issue, that does make things in an unprecedented way more difficult. Having said that, I think that we sort of are in a, it would be a mistake to say we're in a short-term business cycle kind of issue. We're in a short-term political cycle on this, because I think the way to really understand this picture, I alluded to this earlier, is we have a fundamental mismatch between revenues and expenses. Which is, as a percent of GDP, we have a big gap between that. Now, unfortunately, the way people try to solve the problem, the only thing that gets political resonance is let's go for that portion of the expenses, which is the discretionary portion, because that's the easiest one to go to. Well, of the $3.5 trillion expense budget, that's only 19% of it. And so in some ways, we all know this, it's ultimately about the entitlements, it's about the transfers and otherwise, but that's a much more difficult political situation. And so the burden that's falling on the 19%, which is discretionary budget, is pretty intense. And the reason we can't just say this is a political cycle issue that'll go away when Congress starts behaving or otherwise is that it just harks back to a pretty profound 15-year issue of this gap between revenues and expenses that will have to get solved through discretionary spending improvements and productivity improvements, and ultimately through some of the other revenue and expense cuts in the more political tenuous things. So yes, it's harder. I think the rhetoric is harder, but I would think it'd be a mistake to say it's just a short-term issue. I think this is a pretty profound thing that we're going to see for the next decade, which does mean that the challenge for agencies and otherwise as they think about budgeting is not the typical challenge, which is how do we think about incremental cuts, how do we think about sort of improving on the margin. It is, as many in the private sector found through the economic and financial crisis, a bit of a rethink of how do we do what we need to do, sometimes more of it, a lot of it better, with fewer resources altogether. It's sort of a real innovative rethink. So that would be my response to that.
Okay. Mike, you want to?
I would say, first of all, it reminds me a little bit, you were talking about, made a reference to that these are interesting, challenging times. They're actually kind of fun to be in the budgeting world. And I think there is a little bit of that it reminds me of the end of the Cold War in 1989, 90, that kind of time frame. But unfortunately, I think it probably reminds me a little bit more of late 95, which was maybe the worst. I wouldn't say this is quite that bad yet, but what gives you pause here is that just the problem-solving machinery in this town that does not seem to be working very well, and we've had, 3 of varying degrees of severity, potential risk, shutdown drills that we've done this year, and that's too much. That's kind of a symbol of dysfunction that gives you pause about how any problem's going to get solved when you just see that yourselves kind of go through this stop and start motion a lot. So I mean, the challenge, as John said, the challenge is out there, and it's bad enough, but seeing the process not work the way it should is maybe more the concern that we have right now.
Okay. Karin, what did you say?
But, and one thing I would say is the way we've been going the last several years is that from a budget perspective, from the budget officer perspective at Justice, is we just plan for a full year CR. We just tell everyone, don't expect to get it. Everybody gets excited about rolling out the president's budget and let's talk about these enhancements and things. Well, there's not real a lot of enhancements now in the budgets. And so we just planned for a full year CR. And it's a good thing we did for 2011 because we didn't have an enacted appropriation until mid-April. And we took some steps early in January to even, within Justice, we actually had a hiring freeze implemented. The Attorney General came out, directed a hiring freeze. We had treated over 1,800 people net last year in 2011. Federal jobs were lost. And we're going in that direction just to sustain ourselves. And but that's how we're planning. We're just planning on staying flat and how we can tread water. So yes, I find it very interesting. I think that it's more exciting to do budget execution. Budget formulation's fun and exciting too, but and it's more it's fun to sell it and describe it. But it's also, I think, the budget execution part and educating the Hill and our counterparts on the Hill about what the impacts of these different cuts will mean is also an enormous challenge. And we're starting to see what it looks like. And 1,800 people being lost in a 9-10 month period is at least for Justice, is a big deal.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you've been explaining that to the Hill. How, in the words of one prominent candidate, how's that working for you?
As you said earlier, the CJS appropriations and the first minibus that will be enacted on Friday for all our sakes with the full year CR, or the additional extension of the CR. And both the House and Senate marks prior to that had some very difficult choices. And I think we were quite happily surprised to see that the final marks in the conference were higher than previous marks for the federal programs. But it was at the expense, I think about $600 million were shifted from state and local law enforcement assistance were shifted up to the federal program side. So it showed that at least our appropriators and members on the Hill were concerned about, well, wait a second, we're losing FBI agents, we have federal prisons to maintain, we have those types of jobs that are important. So I think, how's it working for us? I just got the information this week. I was quite surprised and happily so, I guess. But it's certainly not enough money to stop treading water.
I think that's the last time you'll hear the word happy on this panel. Jeff, what do you have to say?
Well, I'd just add on a practical level, what makes it this time difficult is the level of uncertainty in so many different ways. And we, in the budget world, deal with a lot of uncertainty from year to year, but it's usually uncertainty around how much of the increase are we going to receive, or are we just going to get adjustments to our inflationary adjustments or the various new and expanded programs, which of those things are we going to get support for from Congress. But the uncertainty that we're dealing with today is an uncertainty around how much of a cut we're going to be receiving, not about how much of the increase that we requested, at least in our case, and I think a lot of agencies are dealing with that. And then that uncertainty is compounded with the great uncertainty, just watching what's going on across the street, which I always refer to across the street because we, from the Library of Congress, we look across the street and we see what's going on over there. But then the other challenge is trying to keep a positive tone within the agency. And let's say we're going to receive 3, 4, 5% or more cut, reminding people that that leaves a 97, 8, or 95% of our budget there, and how do we make sure that we're directing that in the most effective way possible and looking for efficiencies? Because that's a very different way. I mean, it's a glass 95% full as opposed to focusing on the 5% that we're being cut. But the uncertainty challenge, I think, is significant in this for us.
Sure, sure. Well, I don't think we're expecting anybody to divulge their fiscal 13 budget proposals, and but what kinds of strategies, do you, as you kind of, as this era has kind of dawned again on us, have your agencies kind of embraced to deal with these kinds of threats? And Deanna talked about the notion of looking longer term. If you think about this as a longer-term problem, maybe you'd adopt strategies having to do with re-examining some of the old ways of doing business. How do your departments think about this, and what kind of strategies are on the table, if you will? Mike, you want to start us off on that?
Okay, sure. We have, maybe fortunately for a situation like this, we have a pretty strong tradition in DoD. We love to plan, and we do 5-year plans. They've been doing 5-year plans for my entire career, pretty much. So we're used to an annual process where you're going to relook what you're going to do over the next 5 years. Now we're expanding that a little more to more of a 10-year look, because the Budget Control Act kind of forces you to do that. But we're focusing more on the first 5 years. We've had a lot of senior leader discussion on this, and we have some pretty clear guidance from the Secretary of the main thing that he wants us to do, which is to, first of all, to think strategically, to the point of your question, and not just make a bunch of ad hoc choices that add up to minus X billion. So that's number one. And in doing that, he wants us, of course, to protect our core interests and be fair to our people. So these things being fair to your people means that you maybe would, if you think you need to get yourself smaller, you want to do it at a ramp that's kind of fair to the people who've deployed. So that puts some constraints on you, but in looking at that, we felt that we've kind of grouped our thinking into 4 categories that we're looking at, which is how to make ourselves smaller, where to make ourselves smaller, and looking at our capital investment, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later. The compensation side, which we probably wouldn't have looked at nearly so hard were we not forced to, because it's not a strategic, it doesn't give you extra capability, so you would only kind of do it when you're forced to reduce resources. Otherwise, you wouldn't try and look at your compensation. Then we're continuing the efficiencies effort the Secretary Gates started. We really have no choice but to, and we need to deliver on those things, and we're trying to find a little more. And so with those kind of categories, we're looking at how we can find some savings. We're also, though, trying to, and as we've worked through this ourselves, and the Secretary has talked to the President a couple times now about this as well, think about, in terms of protecting our core interests, think about where we're investing to have sort of three looks at things. Where would we want to protect what we have as we draw down? As Jeff was saying, if you still have 95%, well, what do you want to be in there? What do you want to have in the lifeboat? Where can we take some more risk? Where do we need to make some reductions to take more risk? And also, in selected areas, maybe not a lot, where do we actually want to invest more or have more capability? And I think the President's announcement on Australia yesterday is an example of something where even as we're drawing down a little bit, we may have some new initiatives or some areas where we want to strengthen our presence or our capabilities. So that's kind of our general framework.
Mm-hmm. Karin?
Unlike defense, justice pretty much does annual budgeting. While the Budget Control Act may have parameters for security versus non-security or defense, non-defense, where justice sits within the discretionary pot is a pretty big pot. And so we don't know what our numbers could be. So we prepare pretty much just assuming knowing the economic environment and what we went through in April through that whole process. We got out our guidance from the Attorney General to our components pretty late in the fiscal year, but we had been telling everybody, assume a flat budget. That's how we did our whole process, just assuming flat overall and total for the department. But some may be going up, like national security is our highest priority, the FBI in that area. We have a prisons and detention, which is pretty much a mandatory account. We don't have a lot of control over inmates coming in the door, and so everything else in the department. And so then the OMB guidance did not come out until after the BCA was enacted, and that was like mid-August. And we basically had a month to figure out what would -5% and what would -10% look like in total for the department. And so that required some real looks. We had been running various scenarios, and we've done this over the last, I would say, several years, maybe 8 years. We've been running different types of cuts drills and various looks of what 5% less would look like or 10% less would look like. But the focus now has been mostly on duplication, like what functions in law enforcement, for example, are being duplicated. Like, for example, where our task forces are located, our state and local task forces. Do we have duplicative missions in certain areas that we could maybe consolidate? So duplication of effort and consolidations of functions is pretty much where we've focused our efforts, and I think we'll see some of that in the 2013 budget.
Jeff?
I would say we are looking at this with two different strategies. One is a more short-term strategy with more than 2/3 of our budget being supporting pay, staff pay. There's some immediate things that we've had to do, and trying to approach cost avoidance in the least damaging way possible. And we sought and received authority to do buyouts so that we could reduce our staff pay burden without having to do some of the more draconian and painful and disruptive things like furloughs or RIFs, which are, especially in the case of furlough, you're just kicking the can down the road. But then other things in limiting travel and other non-urgent spending. But I call those short terms because those aren't very effective long-term measures. And I think one of the biggest risks in the environment like this is that it results in a general degradation of the mission of the whatever institution, instead of, I think, as Mike was saying, that you really want to look at, and this is our longer-term strategy. We're doing several things, including a really in-depth look at our budget, looking at our core functions and the activities that support those functions, and trying to identify synergies that we might be able to look at, efficiencies, ways that we might consolidate or streamline, with an idea that none of our programs, especially, and we're a small agency, none of our programs, I mean, this is a called out assumption, is considered a not necessary but in these times you have to look at what are the things that are critical and that we may want to do more of and expand, and maybe sacrifice some of those nice to haves in order to make sure that the most important things are being not only maintained but possibly increased. So part of this time is necessity is the mother of invention. So I mean, when you're under this critical situation, you really have to look deep and figure out how do you do, in some cases, more of some things, and maybe not do any more some things that are, again, nice to haves, but this isn't a nice to have situation.
You know, I would just underscore that point, and Cass in the following way picks up on a number of points. The challenge of the continuing resolution cycle and the short-termism that yields is, you know, it's all around how do we tread water while we're in this limbo situation, which has the effect of doing something bizarre, which is disconnecting sort of strategic thinking, prioritization around things that will allow agencies to sustain their mission-critical activities, and sort of the day-to-day decisions on how money is spent, which seems incredible to believe, but of course that's the consequence of saying, well, right now we're in this short-term cycle. We'll have people thinking about a strategy, but we're not going to link those two processes, the strategic planning and I think where the most interesting thinking is going is along the lines of what you were saying, Jeff, which is to say, let's not take the mindset that says we've got all these strategic initiatives we want to pursue that are really critical to where we go, and say, well, we can't afford them right now because Congress will never approve, we'll never do this, we'll never do that. But rather ask the question, let's start with that, make sure those get all the priority wherever we can find them, and then ask the tough question of, well, then what falls on the backside? What falls off? And that's a very, very difficult thing to do in this context, all the more so because when Congress passed its various mandates to different agencies, they weren't thinking about the holistic picture and their constituencies for some of the things that remain at the end of the day. But that process of linking the strategic thinking and the initiative taking to the budget process when it's in this limbo mode is very, very hard to do, but clearly the challenge. I mean, that's the necessary.
Do you think, let's take off on what Deanna said, I mean, this is the necessity being the mother of invention. A lot of us have been, doing this venture called performance budgeting, which is attempting to link budgeting with outcomes. And, is that kind of initiative, DOD has always had a culture that began with PPBS in the 1960s, and they're still doing it in some way. Is that kind of culture and that kind of systematic thinking reinforced by, say, OMB and your congressional partners? Are you swimming against the stream trying to do that kind of analytic cut? Karin, what do you think about that? Is this a propitious time to take on Deanna's challenge there, or is it just keeping your head above water, as we're hearing?
I mean, I know we take what measures are important to us very seriously. We track them every quarter. We look at them. Is there any change in what's happening in a component? And we say, what does this mean? We ask those types of questions. I don't think we're going to see any real, with the hiring freeze that's in effect and will probably be in effect for a lot of the litigating divisions for the rest of this year. I think we will start seeing some of that in cases and stuff probably in 2012. And so then you'll start seeing the change in performance. And then you have to see what the threshold is of what are we taking, what types of cases are we continuing to do and prioritize. But I think we do have that discussion internally, I know, within the department. I know our branch at OMB, our Resource Management Office, is very engaged in the performance questions. I don't know if I get a lot of those questions necessarily from the Hill. They do review our budgets. They do ask questions. I think a lot of the questions are tied to performance, though, the way they ask the questions. We get about 500, which is probably nothing to what you guys get at DOD. We get about 500, questions for the record, in the appropriations process, plus, whatever questions for the record we get through the authorization process. But 500 on approps, and they range from policy to program to performance, and they're all budget related. So, I don't know about a strategic plan necessarily. The highest priorities that we need to manage to. I think we do that. I think that's underlying and always something we do. And I think when you're prioritizing the money that you have, you end up doing that. You end up prioritizing towards the highest priorities.
Yeah.
And things just fall off.
Does that ring a bell, Mike, with you? Is that
well, a couple observations. And let me start with the last thing Karin said. With respect to our relationship with our oversight committees, which I think is a very good one, notwithstanding that the process as a whole is frustrating. Our committees, want to pass their bills on time and are ready to do so if they're allowed to do so, which often they're not. But I think the interaction between our senior leaders and theirs tends to not focus on things like performance management much, for some of the same reasons that a secretary normally doesn't spend a lot of time on. That is when you're the same topics that consume his interactions with senior leaders about what's happening in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, things like that. You tend to have a lot of management attention on those, and it's left to other processes, maybe to follow up on the performance management. I think the performance management, I mean, the processes are in place, as you say. I think they're most applicable and therefore most applied to things that are easier to look at across government travel and IT and things like that than they are about whether or not you should buy the Joint Strike Fighter. Okay. And then the other thing I'd say is that, sort of tying to what Deanna was saying, I think the short-termism imposes a management cost that is not readily apparent to the public. I mean, there's in a couple respects. One, for example, when you're on a CR for 6 months, as we were last year, you can't do any of your new investments. You can't because they're new starts. So you waste all that time. But also just what's going to happen, the stopping and starting, the being careful not to break CR rules, et cetera. Just not to mention the shutdown planning that we did a couple of times last year really just sucks up a lot of management time and attention that could have been spent being more useful with the taxpayer dollars. And so that's, I think, a hidden cost that is not seen, that when you do a CR 1, 2, 3, I guess we're going to number 3 in a week or so here, that all detracts from having the management be maybe as strong as it otherwise would be. Now, the administration, as you know, probably has got a lot of management initiatives going, open government and a couple other things, and so attention is paid, and we do get direction, but there's only so much time, and a lot of the focus ends up being diverted to either the short-termism or what's going on with Afghanistan today. That there's a lot of competing interests, shall I say, for management time.
Yeah, yeah.
I would just underscore something you said, Mike, which is that if you believe that the big challenge is not about the incremental change, but about sort of transforming some of the things that are done differently, then almost by definition, you only get to that more efficient or re-engineered place through some level of investment. Another way of sort of echoing what we're saying here is the environment of CRs and otherwise has separated the operating budget issues with the capital expense issues. And so you almost get to a situation where you allow the deterioration of mission critical, but whether it's buildings or otherwise, but inability to capture, any savings that could be done with some short-term investment that would yield long-term benefits on an operating budget. So that's really a very, I think, profound problem for most agencies, that you can't link those two if you're constantly trying to maintain whatever existing operating budget you have.
How do you make the case to your clients, to the Hill and OMB and others, the case for longer-term programs that don't have immediate benefits but have high costs? I'm thinking about capital now.
Right.
I know the library's been doing some investments, and how does that play out?
Actually, that is a huge challenge, and it does tie into what we're talking about, strategic planning. And the strategic planning office is actually part of my office of the chief financial officer, and we do a lot of work to try to keep the strategic plan away from this sort of lofty document that people spend a lot of time working on, and then it sits on a shelf and collects dust until next time you update it, but really bring it down to something real that you're looking at. Is this an accurate reflection of our priorities, and to what extent can we have that reflect how we're allocating resources? And we constantly ask people to challenge the plan. Don't look like it's carved in stone. But on the capital investment thing, one of the more frightening comments I heard, this is several years ago, we were briefing our appropriations clerks and about a capital investment, and we had a business case, and we had what we thought was a very sound briefing on why this. It was a detailed brief about something in our budget, and the appropriations clerk at the time said, Jeff, you made a fantastic case. This is absolutely the right thing to do, but right now we don't have the luxury to make long-term sound investments. And if you translate that into the whole federal government, you look at what's happening with our infrastructure, roads. Any agency, and in our case, the library, our main priority in capital investment is in storage for our vast collections. And the Librarian of Congress has a great analogy. We have the Strategic Petroleum Reserve for the country. He refers to the Library of Congress as the Strategic Knowledge or Information Reserve. And the fact is, we're getting collections, and this is again, as he says, the closest thing to the mint record of creativity in this nation. And if we stop collecting because we don't have any place to put it, it's gone forever. It's not something you can recapture. So you can translate, our little capital investment priority, which is huge for us, but into any area in transportation and defense, but how do you get the conversation to focus on and make it not a luxury to talk about the long-term strategic need to invest in these things?
Right. Well, Aaron, how's that look at justice? Is that the same kind of?
Well, just in the 2012 conference agreement, our information technology, our centralized account for the department, there's IT accounts within each of our components, but that took a major hit in the final conference agreement, which is going to hurt. And our law enforcement radios account, FBI, DEA, ATF, Marshal Service share a centralized account, and that took a major hit as well. And we're trying to get everybody on a wireless system. And that was one of the recommendations from the 9/11 Commission was, we need to be able to communicate. And it's been 10 years since 9/11, and we're still not fully deployed with these radios. So, it's just inching along, and then the budget keeps getting cut because it's this non-personnel account, and capital account that people are just like, well, I'd rather have the people. And 85% of the department's accounts are salaries and expenses accounts. So, you have that choice is the issue. And so when one of our 2013 initiatives that we really looked at in our consolidations was trying to move some of these accounts around to places where it made more sense, where maybe they could be more stable, and trying to consolidate some of our IT programs and looking at other ways that we could strengthen the IT programs, have more of the strategy done at Main Justice and some more of the operational stuff done in the components, like the FBI and the other law enforcement components. And we're still working that through, and we're just planning and starting to move ahead on some of this because we have to. But there's no money. There's really no money. It's kind of like doing it on a shoestring and just prioritizing what can we get done this year.
Yeah, it sounds like there's money, but it's all encumbered. It's encumbered by operating costs and mandatory programs. And the question is, getting to Deanna's theme, can you see over time kind of freeing that up by doing a more strategic, longer term?
It takes money to invest first.
Yeah.
It's right now the majority of the money is committed to operations and maintenance of the legacy systems. So you don't have the money to invest in the new system. And so you can only do it a little piece at a time.
Now, Mike, you're actually an agency that has a real strategic plan that works, yes?
I think we have a stronger planning
Process.
tradition
Yeah.
than many, and I would say on this point, maybe it would never say there's unanimity. We're such a big place, but I think there's consensus among our leadership that if you look at past drawdowns and defenses tend to have somewhat of a sine wave since World War II over time. Partly related to what's going on in the world, of the budgets going up and coming back down again. That in the drawdown cycles in the past, that capital investment has tended to take a disproportionate share of the reduction. And you can understand why that is. Sometimes it's a lot tougher to get rid of people or to go after their compensation. But I think as people looked at our situation this time, we felt that it was not possible, maybe it's never possible, and it's certainly not possible now to make all the savings we need to make by going after investing in the future. So, it's not comfortable to look at compensation, but we're doing it partly because we feel like we have to, that we cannot just do a cycle where we just invest in the future. As everyone knows, I think our investments often take a long time to come to fruition. Aircraft carriers maybe being the poster child of something that takes, years and years and years to build. I think the virtue maybe of some of that is, our oversight committees, I think, understand pretty well the idea of capital investment in DoD. That people know that an aircraft or a ship only lasts so long, and and it takes a long time to build one, so you have to backward plan and put the money in to get the new one before the old one wears out. So that kind of thinking is kind of inherent, but notwithstanding that, capital investment has tended to suffer in past drawdowns. We're trying to have a little better balance now, which is why I was saying that compensation is one of the areas we're looking at, and just the force structure, making ourselves smaller, because that's the way that we feel you get the best balance. Is because when you grow a force or maintain a force, then those people need, of course, compensation and health care and a place to live and weapons to train on and all these sort of things. So if you only looked at, say, the training and readiness, that would be a very bad outcome. If you only took away the investment in the future, that would be a bad outcome. So the size of the force has to be looked at too, so that you can maintain what you have. And again, that's something I think that's pretty well understood within our leadership, and I think reasonably well on the same page with Congress, that capital investment has a role.
Let me ask one more question, and I think we'll turn to the audience. I want to talk about the politics. We have Mr. Gates, before he left, undertook a significant initiative for efficiency, and he trimmed and proposed a lot of cuts that are probably still playing themselves out. Is that a rewarding process for a leader to stick your neck out and do that, or is there, or like in everything else in budgeting, no good deed go unpunished?
I think there was a little bit of both there. We're a department full of, Secretary Gates was a very strong leader, Secretary Panetta's a strong leader, and we have a lot of proactive people there, and we love to plan, as I've said. So getting out in front of kind of our own future is kind of the way we are. And of course, we've had some warning. The President made a speech in April at GW, I think it was, and talked about the $400 billion. So we've had some warning that this was coming, and we've been getting our heads around this for a little bit. So I think that it's natural that we are planning on how to do this best, and going through all the process of talking internally with our senior leadership about what makes the most sense to do. I think Secretary Gates did have the intention a little bit of trying to maybe ward off worse things by showing that he was being a good steward of the taxpayer money, and I'm not sure that really, helped us as much as he would have hoped. When the Budget Control Act came, the numbers are the numbers, and yeah, I think you do tend to start from where you were. So if you made some reductions already, maybe that didn't help you. On the other hand, we had increases, defense had increases prior to that time. So you can look at it compared to where Secretary Gates started from and say, well, maybe we didn't really get the real benefit of offering up efficiencies before the Budget Control Act hit. But you could also, if you used a different time frame, say that we have, we'll be okay.
Yeah. What about justice? Does that comment on the incentives to offer up
I think
pain?
any offsets that we offer to OMB or to the Hill are received with mostly acceptance. There have been some things where not necessarily want to do it. There's been some reorganizations that we've proposed that may have not been the most popular, but things we need to do to save money, and I think that resulted in a penalty for offering it. So you gotta always think about the timing of the release of things sometimes. What I try to do is whenever we get our appropriations, since 2007, our appropriation subcommittee has required a spending plan. And not every committee has required that, but Justice has had to do that. And we try to include everything in our spending plan, all reorganizations and reprogrammings and stuff in just one document. And I think that the committees appreciate it so that they have an opportunity to review and know what's coming. And I think that has helped us as far as being, transparent with what our plan is for that full year. And so, yeah, I think that has helped us to be more upfront about things. But yeah, any offset though they usually like.
Can an agency, Jeff, preempt cutback actions elsewhere by taking things into their own hands and being bold?
I think so, and I think you have to. I sometimes, when I read the paper, I realize every day that I would never make a good politician, but within agency, I mean, both internally and externally, I've tried to push very hard for transparency in everything we do on our budget processes internally to try to achieve buy-in within the agency, and then work really hard with our appropriators to explain what we're trying to do. And although people sometimes raise concerns about the risks of offering, revealing offsets and efficiencies we're achieving in order to do more of something else, my feeling, and it's that this push towards absolute transparency and trying to make solid cases for what we're doing has paid dividends. And I would say that the other risk, of not going that route, is that once you get caught and not being completely upfront in how these things you're shifting around, then you're sunk, because your credibility in presenting information both internally and externally it's called into question. But I think that there is a risk. I think in this time of cuts that we've said earlier, you have to look at what more can we do beyond what the straight across the board cuts are in order to ensure that you are shoring up the most critical programs and using your strategic plan as a basis and keeping it real and making sure that's the basis of your highest priorities. I think that's one thing that interesting. Strategic plans often I find, can be so lofty that people, they sign off on them and then they go about doing their spending plan without any reference to it. And you think, how can you possibly be doing that? And you're making decisions that the agency has not agreed to, and finding strategies to make sure that there's that constant reference point of what are the annual objectives that relate to the results we're trying to achieve in a strategic plan. It's not easy, and it's not magical. There's not a machine where you turn a knob on one end and performance and it spits out dollars on the other end. But as long as you're keeping the conversation with the focus on that, I think it pays dividends.
Paul, I would answer your question probably much more forcefully in the following way. I think the incentives for leadership in agencies to offer up these things are almost non-existent. And I think that some play the strategy of saying, let's show ourselves to be responsible to see if it buys us some game. It usually just, they get swallowed up immediately, thank you very much, with very little credit given to it. And if you think of the sort of dynamic that's going on, particularly because it's political leadership that comes in typically temporarily, that is going to be focused on the new thing, the brand new initiative, and the best that they'll do is say, I'll just ignore that stuff. But the idea that I'm going to use political capital to take on constituencies that have developed around things that today are no longer priorities, I mean, I could either spend my time on this or spend my time on that, and I'll tell you 9.5 times to 10, the person who is in a role for 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, even 8 years, is going to choose one over the other. And I think that's actually one of the structural elements here. The only way that can be offset, I think, is not so much to ask people in those leadership positions to take on those constituencies and use up the capital and their leadership to achieve it, but rather to do sort of what you were saying, Karin, you're doing on the Hill, others are doing, which is to help translate to the people who ultimately make the appropriations, authorizations, appropriations, and the public, that when you say we need to do these things, you really communicate a vision of what is this that this is trying to accomplish, so that when things fall off the map, that doesn't get, because typically what happens, the noise comes from the constituents that are going to be affected when something goes away. Those constituencies exist already, and they're very powerful, and they're very active in lobbying Congress and lobbying the public through articles and the press and otherwise that make it very hard to want to take on those battles. But there's less of a constituency around the view of, what does the FBI do to ensure enforcement, et cetera? And this new capital investment you were using as an example, or the investments in collections, those cases aren't made as vociferously because the constituencies don't exist as much. So I think the incentives are not good to get people to make these strategic trade-offs. And the only tool I think that those folks have to improve that is to get better at communicating the link between the money and what it is that these agencies do that matters to people ultimately. And you know, that loop needs to be strengthened. I think Sean Donovan, Secretary Donovan was just talking about that. I would say that's one of the things he's been quite effective at doing. You know, people think of HUD and it's like these programs and nobody even knows what they are, and yet he's started to move the discussion to, no, this is about, you know, veterans' homeless issues. We care about that as a society, you know. So those are where the incentive, where shifting those incentives, I think it is quite hard, but really, really important to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think just one additional note on that is in strategic planning, I think that's often the whole part of engaging the stakeholders in the Congress and OMB in this process is a piece that often is missed. And it's like, if you engage them in this process and get them implicated in this plan so that they're sort of signing off on it. I know the people and the priorities can change, but to the extent that, and this is just picking up on your point about the communicating the vision, is making sure that, because if you're off here and with your vision and they're saying, well, no, we're not with you on that, then you're going to be wasting a lot of resources on something that's not going to get the kind of support. But if you can engage them in the conversation and you get the head nod on, yes, we're with you, then when you start bringing the budget across the street and saying these are the resources we need to support those priorities that we've been talking to you about and that we've all agreed on, it makes a big difference.
You have to convince them that it's a real document that's linked to decisions and not just an exercise. Why don't we open it up to all of you here and get some questions and dialogue going with a lot of you in the audience. I know work in agencies and have a lot of engagement with these issues. So we have a microphone set up back there? Okay. Who wants to go first? This is, we have, someone's going to bring a mic around.
Good morning. Thank you. From the Office of the United States Trade Rep. One of the things that is generally always happens in these times is, let's say, the leadership we get from the Office of Management and Budget, which is across the board. I mean, executive order came out last week. We have across the board cuts by 2013, travel, and a few other miscellaneous board items. Don't we deserve, as agencies, more strategic leadership, let's say, on, as you talk about investment, where should dollars be invested more or less, you know, from the big picture? Because we're all now talking about within individual agencies or organizations, departments, where's the big picture? Yeah. Certainly like to share comments or hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Well, let me just take one and we can hear what others have to say. I mean, I think in any administration, there's going to be a combination of focus on the minutia, line item budgeting, and focus on the big picture. And that's just the real world of budgeting. You're never going to get people to say it's all about strategic goals and nothing else. I mean, people care about, you know, about the dollars and the travel and the line items, and it has symbolic significance if nothing else. So I do think this administration has laid out some things on the performance agenda. They've got their priority goals. They're forcing the agencies to adopt those goals. They're reviewing those goals. We have the GPRA Modernization Act, which was enacted earlier this year, that requires OMB, and this I think is a valuable departure, to articulate some government-wide goals. Now they haven't put their cards out on the table yet on that. But I think once they do, hopefully there'll be a more robust set of policy goals that OMB will be taking ownership for on behalf of the President. I think that's a work in progress. What else does anybody?
And I was going to mention the Government Performance and Results Act, the Modernization Act, that's supposed to have those government-wide goals. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. You know, but I will say, from my perspective, you know, the OMB tasks that are coming out, it's so many of them, there's all these various stovepipe organizations with an OMB, and the tasks like Campaign to Cut Waste is important, I think, to document what we're doing across the government in tangible ways that people can understand. I mean, we're already saving money in travel and conferences and all these other areas, and government-owned vehicles and stuff like that. But I think in having it in these high-level categories and being able to track it and say, okay, well, here's your target. Let's see, are we actually going to save it in ways that we could explain it to the public? I think that's a good thing. But I will find that it is rather tiresome that there's just so many of these drills coming out, and they're coming from various parts of OMB and not in a consolidated, coordinated fashion, it seems. That's been kind of something that I've been frustrated by personally, and my staff, because we're the ones that answer and coordinate all these. And because a lot of this information is inputted into OMB through the resource management offices, and you'd think that it could just come out from one place. But I think it's a good thing that we are collecting information at a high level with narrative to describe how we are saving the money, and the priority goals that will come out that are from the Modernization Act of things that are cross-agency will be very interesting to see, and hopefully that'll be, I think, with the 2013 President's budget is the timing.
Right, do you have any?
I guess I'd say I'd find it hard to offer, off the top of my head, a better balance of what we have now. Excuse me, we have things that can appear stovepipe from OMB. I think there's a logic maybe of why they have a management council and they have a CIO group and a CFO group that we're part of. Mm-hmm. It does lead to some confusion and perhaps potential duplication on the ground if you've got your own agency's organizational goals and then you've got strategic management plans that are between you and OMB. But I think in our case it hasn't been too much of a problem just because our biggest strategic investment decisions tend to be mostly internal to the agency, because they're a luxury, because we're so big. I don't know. And the OMB guidance tends to come more on support functions, again, on things like IT, travel, whatever, that I can see there's a certain logic of telling agencies to kind of be on the same page.
Yeah. Well, on behalf of this conference, I'm glad that you're all ignoring the spirit of the executive order and are here. In any case. Other questions? We have time for a few more. Who else? Okay.
Someone mentioned that there's a fair amount of uncertainty about the budget, and that creates some frustration. What should mid-level managers do this year and next year to prepare for potential cuts? What do the tea leaves actually say about potential funding reductions?
Wants to take that one on? Good question.
Well, I mean, just to get the conversation going, I would just come back to the point I made at the beginning, which is that, there is a lot of uncertainty, and this political process will do what it will do. And I don't, I challenge anyone to read the tea leaves with any high degree of certainty, with accuracy. But I think that if one takes a step back and looks at the broader context, which is whatever this immediate thing it happens to be or doesn't, whether the super committee does achieve anything or doesn't it, whether the automatic cuts come in or don't, there is a more fundamental issue around resourcing and the agencies and around budgets in general. And so, what I think the advice to middle management would do is begin that process of being more strategic, long-term thinking. It'll be very hard to do with the limbo budgets that there are, but if you have a clear vision of where you would go to be mindful of the critical mission issues that have to happen, and of where an end state would be 5 years from now that would be consistent with a lower footprint, that's got to be the right direction. And anything short of that is just sort of, let's get in the shelter and wait to see if we ride out this one particular bomb, which I think is really not a constructive way for the entire federal budget to operate. So it's you know, and if one takes that attitude, then it becomes not a just get through this political cycle, but rather it's a long-term dialogue that is a profound one, that it's not just the U.S., it's every society is facing this fundamental problem.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think our deputy secretary, outgoing deputy secretary, in his last speech, I think, made remarks to that effect, that if we can't afford it now, we can't afford it later. That given the demographic, you know, of the baby boom retirement coming up, that it's unlikely that things will get much better because we'll suddenly grow our way out of this or something like that. So I think that managers need to be prepared for, probably at best, the flat budgets that were described, but also, you know, of your folks are probably, I mean, I think most people expect that there'd probably be some reduction in benefits or some greater contribution asked, so that you're going to see kind of flat compensation and flat budgets, and so people need to be thinking now about how to manage the people to not get dejected by living in those circumstances, because I think that is our reality. And I think the flat budget doesn't bother people on the personal level all that much. Most people can adapt to that. I think there will be a little bit challenged long term about maybe on the benefit side. I mean, in the near term, it's maybe not a huge issue because of the economic climate. We're not seeing much turnover at our agency. Right. I expect there's probably similar at others, but I think longer term, if we live with flat compensation or changes in the retirement rules, things like that, that's going to be a managing your personnel issue that everyone needs to deal with.
I think one thing that, go ahead.
I would just add that, you know, from a middle management level, one of the things, a few things is trying to the extent that you have a strategic framework that you're looking at, and looking at the things, if you know that no matter what the end number is, that there are things that you're going to do, is act decisively on those things that you know are going to be there regardless. I think there's a tendency not just to be paralyzed and not do anything because there's so much uncertainty. So if the more you can zero in on the things you know you can and will do regardless, move on those things so that when the question marks start clearing up, then you can focus more attention on the things that you didn't know about. I don't know if that's making sense, but I think one of the biggest problems that I've seen is that people become paralyzed and don't do anything and just stop everything. And there are things that I've had just a conversation with a budget person in one of our business units the other day. There are things you know, regardless of these scenarios we've looked at, that you're going to do. So do those. I find that that's helpful, because then you sort of free up your resources to focus on the other things that you're not sure about.
No regrets moves. so to
Right,
speak.
right.
I think what we've heard from this panel is that this new environment of less, which is going to be persistent for many years, is going to put more emphasis by you on making your case and reframing what you do in terms of things that make public value. It's also sometimes nice to remember what John Kennedy said: we do this not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And I always use that in hard times. One more question.
Okay,
Any-
gentlemen.
Hi.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, right down here.
Over here, Debbie.
Oh, don't, I'm
Hi.
sorry, over there. Sorry.
Debbie Robinson with
Debbie.
OPM. I'm really happy to hear about the concerns with the people issues that may arise from what the tea leaves are telling us and the current budget crisis that we're in. And in the spirit of avoiding some of that paralysis that you're speaking of, and maybe re-engaging and motivating strategic human capital focus within the organization, I wonder if you find yourselves now reaching deeper into the human capital community and perhaps starting to collaborate a little bit closer with forecasting planning, not only for perhaps buyouts, but now the impact of those buyouts, and creating motivation and engagement among employees, so that that flat line in the budget process is not transferable to the performance, individual employee performance. So I wonder, how are you guys managing that or dealing with that or looking towards that?
Have any,
I would say for the Department of Justice as a total, I can't speak to that. I know that there are some components within the department that are offering the buyouts. My component, the Justice Management Division, offered buyouts. One of my deputies left which was very difficult for me. 42 years of service, and it was very difficult to have someone like that walk out the door with that level of experience. And we also lost 2 other very senior people, took the buyout. And so you're losing the talent pool. I would also say that we have an amazing talent pool below it as well. So that's something that I've, within my own organization of analysts, have always focused on. I always think it's important to do training and development. In the past, though, I think one thing that I never really cared so much about was turnover. We always had a high attrition rate. It's a budget shop. It's like a meat grinder. You work so many hours, and after a few years, people move up and move on into components and go into senior positions elsewhere, and I'm okay with that. Now I'm starting to look around going, well, we have a hiring freeze, so maybe I should think about retention as something to be focused on, and which is not good for the rest of the department because there are other positions where they're needed potentially. So I don't know. I guess I've always focused on that. I won't, but I think I'm refocusing more so on maybe I should have a little bit more thought about retention efforts that I didn't necessarily do before.
Mm-hmm. Jeff?
2 things. One is this gets to the point of trying to focus on the 95% or the 93%. Is that in fact we just I just was part of a panel with the library's chief of staff yesterday with a supervisory group, and something that I really appreciated about what the chief of staff focused on is the value that we bring to the agency and talking to the folks about the positive side of what we're trying to do and engage them in this great work that we're a part of. The other thing that I've worked with the Librarian of Congress to do to establish something called the Librarian's Idea Box, and I think I've heard of a couple of examples of this happening in other agencies where we're reaching out to the staff and asking them what kinds of thoughts they have about how we can achieve efficiencies or synergies or what have you in this process. And because a lot of the staff are out there sitting in their offices or cubicles saying, God, if someone would just listen to me, I see this great solution, and no one is hearing me or listening to me, and using that process as a way of drawing out good ideas. And maybe through this process we'll get 50% of them sort of, well, we couldn't implement that, or get rid of all mid-management or something like, but there might be some really good ideas. I know that at HUD, at the AGA conference that I went to last summer, I think it was the deputy CFO there has a similar initiative, and they have achieved some real cost savings, and I think it's beyond just achieving cost savings. It's engaging the staff and making them feel like they're a part of this process, and that they're part of the solution.
Mm-hmm. And Mike, you'll have the last word.
Okay, I was going to say I'm a little more of a customer than a director of personnel policies in the department because we have a different undersecretary that's in charge of that. I will say on the senior executive side, we are trying to be more strategic. Things I think a lot of this we actually have probably gotten from OPM of trying to have more of a talent management system in the senior executives that support the secretary than we've had previously, thinking about how you're going to backfill person A if they leave and having a strong bench, all those sort of things. On the GS side, I feel like I've done 3 different systems almost the 3 years I've been the PAPL manager. I came to DOD and I learned the National Security Personnel System, then I unlearned it as it was repealed, and we've had a little more flux there, which has been a little frustrating. But the senior executive side, I think we are getting a little better at how we manage people, although it's the federal hiring process is always a little slower than you'd like.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, listen, we have the rest of the conference is going on. I think we have to end the session. I want to thank our panelists and thank all of you. Good. Thank you.